How did we go from hats being a crucial part of our fashion, culture, and economy to almost non-existent in less than 50 years? Where hat wearing is now viewed as something for special events, or the eccentric, or just the royal family.
What the hell happened? Like, this is kind of nuts when you really think about it. It's so drastic, it's so intense. Like, what the hell happened?
But more importantly, if hats are no longer a crucial part of our dress and fashion, then why is it that milliners and hatters are still able to own and operate successful businesses? Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into why, specifically American women, stopped wearing hats as a standard fashion accessory.
Well, I didn't know that I wanted to become a milliner, but I've been sewing since I was 5 and always been around family that has sewed. It just kind of naturally led me into going to fashion design school. And I always loved hats. Of course, I dressed up, and when I would do costumes, I would make hats, not the right way, but attempted to with the costumes I would make. And then I moved to Chicago to pursue costumes and ended up meeting a milliner that was talking about the traditional techniques of hat making. And I thought, this is so cool. This is, and talking about this 200-year-old technique. And so when I looked into learning more about it back then, there really wasn't a lot offered. So I ended up going to Australia and doing an apprenticeship. And that's where the light bulb went off. Yeah. And since I knew how to hand sew, it just came really natural. And I thought, this is what I meant to do.
So first things first, there's basically 2 main trades that created hats that were worn by people. There was the hatter trade, and then there was the millinery trade. The hatter trade is the trade where they would take wool, beaver fur, rabbit fur, felt, capelines, and they would steam them, process them, and block them on wooden blocks. This is also the trade where we get the term Mad Hatter.
Put mercury in the felt to help stiffen it. So when you're working with the felt and molding it over, the mercury would seep into your pores and really make you mad. So, and that was only banned in the United States in the 40s, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So this is an alcohol-based sizing.
And now, my dear, as you were saying...
The other trade is the millinery trade. Now, here's what's really interesting about the millinery trade. It is actually one of the first female-dominated trades in history in the West. The way milliners work is they either work using straw, and there were like sewing machines for straw, or you could hand sew straw, or they actually worked in buckram, a fabric material, or silk and wire. And so the actual construction of the hat is innately different too from hatters. Also, hatters traditionally usually worked more with male clients. Milliners worked with female clients. Hatters were male, milliners were female.
Back in the day, millinery was just around every corner, but it allowed people to be expressive and do things a little avant-garde without it being something you wear. And so I think people were scared to do things with fashion, where I think they could have been a little bit more creative with hats. I think that's kind of where creativity started, in my opinion, as far as just doing more avant-garde things and taking risks than going from like 10 buttons to 3,
This is so cool. It's such a look.
Yeah.
The millinery trade and hat wearing honestly reached its peak at the end of the Victorian era and the end of the 19th century, so the very end of the 1800s. And like any graph, you gotta have the peak before you have the decline, right? To me, this is a really good indication of what's coming, because the millinery trade reached its essentially peak of power, peak of influence, and peak of negative impact that we actually have in the United States the creation of the Audubon Society. And the Audubon Society was actually created in direct response to the millinery trade killing off so many birds that they were worried that these species were going to go extinct. And from that moment on, they start organizing and they start lobbying and they start pushing for for legislation to happen in state and national congresses to protect birds. New York State actually passed a law, banned the use of 43 different bird species for feathers. This kind of blew my mind. So this is not all of them, but this is some of them. Green herons, 2 species of night herons, the screech owl, the skylark, the sooty and white terns, pelicans, scarlet ivies, buntings, Bohemian waxwings, swift, magpie, snow bunting, condor, and jays. Like, I knew about egrets, you know, obviously, but I did not realize that they were like just, you see a bird and you're just like ugh. Anyways, it was a lot. And then in 1918, actually, President Wilson signed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that protected our migratory birds here in North America, and especially waterfowl like egrets from being hunted for feathers. But I think just this negative press that's coming right before and during and right after World War I, it just kind of starts to set the tone, I think, of what is to come.
One thing is that I don't sketch my hats because I can't draw as much as I've tried. Everything's in my head. No, I don't run out of ideas. If anything, I can't keep up with them. For me, it's just working with the material in my hands, you know, working on these old blocks and having the energy of people who used to work on them come through in the making of each hat, and just kind of letting the material become what it wants. I love to work with vintage trims, especially 20s and 30s trims from France. Just the delicacy and just you can see the handwork that went into a lot of the materials and trims that I use, and be able to think that I'm giving it a new space opposed to collecting mold in some warehouse basement somewhere, you know, and adding it to something modern. It's just, I love the idea of just all these centuries coming together to be a one-of-a-kind hat. A lot of people who come to me, they understand my aesthetic, they realize that I'm sculptural in my process, and so they allow me to be the artist that I am, and, you know, and create that way. So
1920s. Again, you might be like,
How many people wore hats in the 1920s? I'm
like, you're right, but they were cloches, and you know what? That didn't do the millinery trade any favor. So in the 1920s, as basically a direct result of World War I and the Spanish influenza, I think we can all relate to the 1920s now in a way that we probably honestly don't want to, but here we are. Society is completely different. Women are wearing shorter skirts, the waist is dropped, it's much looser fitted garments, they're chopping their hair off in short bobs, and as a result, the hats that women are wearing are no longer what their mothers were wearing. Where the hats made by milliners, like I said, are wire and fabric, they're also usually perched atop of the hairstyle and not actually meant to fit on the head, where a cloche is actually meant to fit on your head. It's a very tightly fitted hat that is very close to your face. The cloche is also not made by buckerman wire. It is actually made usually with felt. And so that is directly taking work away from the female-dominated millinery trade and into the hands of the hatter trade. The other issue with cloches is because they are so simple and they are so boring. I love cloches, don't get me wrong, I love them, but they're boring, is that they actually became very easy to mass produce. Where hats, especially pre-1920, you couldn't mass produce those really. Like, they were unique pieces of art that were made by milliners and artisans who were trained in that with their own artistic eye. And it was a very individualized experience, and it's a very individualized hat. Like, no hat's ever exactly the same, right? Cloches, you can make them the same because it's basically the same shape over and over again. You just change the ribbon, you change the flower, you just change something little. So we're seeing hats go from being custom made by artisans into a more mass manufactured fast fashion industry. The thing too with cloches and what was starting to happen is women were also starting to go more and more just without hats in general, because they had shorter hair, they would fix it, they would style it. Hats didn't feel as required by women in society, and so there was this growing fear of hatlessness.
Yeah, my favorite milliner from a long time ago, Lily Deshay.
Okay, yeah.
I have several of her hats that I just have as inspiration around, and I actually knew her daughter, who's still alive. She dabbled in hat making as well. I own a couple of Lily Deshay hat blocks, and with everything I do here, I feel like the energy of them surround me while I'm working, and oh my gosh, I've read some amazing books by her that of just how millinery was back then, and she had this, I think it was like 9-story building on Park Avenue, and hearing about, and especially knowing her daughter and getting personal stories from her, having a bubble bath, taking a bubble bath on the 9th floor where she lived, and having a meeting with her employees at the same time. It's just always champagne and her smoking, and just to be able to have a successful business that supports 9 levels on Park Avenue. Yeah. Yes, it's just awesome.
In millinery, a few leaders possessed of fertile imaginations are chiefly responsible for the continually astounding headgear of the American female. For an original chapeau dreamed up by John Fredericks, well-heeled women may pay anywhere from $35 to an occasional $750.
Now, luckily or unluckily, well, I guess gray. Thing is, in 1929, we have Black Tuesday. And we have the start of the Great Depression, the stock market crashes, and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. I'm really tired of talking about things that happened in our past that we actively live through every day. Especially as a elder millennial. While the 20s kind of sucked for millinery, the 1930s, it was actually pretty good. So the 1930s, we're seeing this little uptick in millinery. We're seeing this mild resurgence happen, in part because of actually the Great Depression, because it became cheaper to change your hat than it would be to change your entire outfit and buy new clothes. So women were spending a little bit more money on hats to create updated styles, their dresses, without having to actually create an entirely new outfit. Also, as a direct response to the cloche, this explosion of extremely avant-garde, creative, and interesting hat styles. They're really tiny hats. You have fruit on your head. Extremely artistic. It's extremely interesting. And it all actually kicked off with the Eugenie hat, basically 1931. And this hat's actually, when you look at it, it is like the iconic 1930s style hat.
Yes, Rollo. Yes, Euphemia. These are the things that your dear great-grandmama and her mama used to wear on their pretty heads. What, Rollo? You think they're terrible? Well, so do I. All except that one in the middle.
This is all for adults. Kids and teenagers, adolescents, what I was just telling you guys had no effect on them whatsoever. There is a lot of discourse around the fact that teenagers are not wearing hats in the 1930s and 40s. There's a lot of concern by the millinery industry about teenagers not wearing hats. And the thing is you can see this. If you watch media from the 1930s and 40s, you actually see this. You don't see kids wearing hats. You don't see teenage girls wearing hats. Not like before. Now, when I say they're not wearing hats, I don't mean that they're not wearing berets or tans or, winter headgear to keep your head warm. What I'm talking about is they're not wearing necessarily the Eugenie hat. That's adult women. That's the older generation. The kids, the teenagers, they're not. They're not interested in wearing hats. They don't want to look like their mom. They don't want to look like their grandma. That's what's happening. And the thing is when you're a kid or a teenager in the 30s and 40s, that means you're an adult in the 50s and the 60s. And when you think of adults in the 1950s, not old adults, but people in their 20s, do you think of them in hats? Does Marilyn Monroe wear a hat? So what happened is the hatless teenagers of the 1930s and 40s became the hatless adults of the 1950s and 60s. Now looking back on it, we think, oh, hey, no, they absolutely wore hats, but that's because hats are still required in certain levels of formality.
Hats can transform a person. I love when I make a hat for someone who started out telling me they don't look good in hats, or they need to wear a hat because they're going to Derby and they don't think they look good in anything. Working with them, and because I can look at someone's physique, hair length and all that, and know what style and shapes would look best on them. But to make something that we worked on together and then to have them put it on and it changes them. They stand a little taller, they smile a little bigger, and it gives them that confidence that they didn't realize was deep inside them. So that's what I love about Millinery, is seeing something that was there but was hidden coming back out. I've had customers tell me that they would wear my hats out and that they felt invisible for years, and that how many compliments they got, going out to dinner. And that's why I do what I do, is to make people feel beautiful.
Hats are still required in certain levels of formality. They were worn to church. The Vatican II happened in the 1960s and 70s, and that's when the regulations for women covering their head in the Catholic Church were taken away, and women no longer had to do that. But up until that point, you did have to wear a hat. Or if you were just going to a Protestant church for Easter Sunday, or just covering your head in church in general, was a part of the culture.
Spring is in the air, a heady prospect, and from heads, it's a natural step to hats. The Easter bonnet is tops in my lady's mind as we pass from dour winter into a cheerier clime. For a preview of the chapeau stylings that have the uppermost this season, we visit the Spanish Monastery Garden outside Miami, where a chic quintet model a sequence of hats by the nation's leading milliners.
And so we're seeing people not go to church as much as they used to. We're seeing church regulations change, so women were no longer required to cover their head. We are seeing the rise of hair products and hair styling because of the 1950s and 60s.
Many women average 2 hours a week in a beauty salon.
We're also seeing bigger hair, curly hair, and the bouffant of the 1960s. Like, can you imagine a beehive covered up in a hat? No. Women were going and getting their hair set. I mean, all of us with grandmas remember, they would go and get their hair set once a week. And when women didn't want to go and get their hair set to then immediately crush it with a hat the following day, they wanted to try and maintain that set for as long as possible. Hats became less important, and women just started to leave them off. And also the fashion leaders, like I said, who were teenagers of the 30s and 40s, are the fashion leaders of the 50s and 60s, and they were not wearing hats. So Jackie Kennedy actually does take blame for the lack of hat wearing. Her and her husband, John F. Kennedy, they were very young when he was sworn into office, and they were not interested in wearing hats, either one of them. Jackie Kennedy got married in 1953. Her going away outfit, social etiquette decreed that she should wear a hat, but she hated hats so much that she actually carried the hat in her hands instead of wearing it on her head, so that way she wasn't really breaking social etiquette rules, but she didn't want to wear the hat. And when we think of Jackie Kennedy, we think of the pillbox, but we also think of her hair, and that was actually very strategically done. So the Millinery Union actually was a huge supporter of John F. Kennedy's campaign. They donated a lot of money to his campaign, and so Jackie actually understood that even though she didn't like hats, she still had to wear hats. And so that's why she started wearing the pillbox hat that Halston would create, who would later go on to become a very famous fashion designer. But her hairstylist and hairdresser Kenneth actually would create these hairdos that were very full and round and wavy in the front, and then she strategically wore the hat on the back of her head. So that way the hair was still the central focus of her outfits, and she still had the hat on for basically political reasons.
When I was actually looking for images for this video, I came across this spread from Vogue 1961, and in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a Halston pillbox hat. Now notice how this is actually worn on the front of the head, over the forehead, and that all of these hats are actually worn forward. This really helps further emphasize the difference between the original intent of the hat and how Jackie actually set a completely new style with how she actually wore these hats.
Now, all of this mixed together also brings up the point that in the 1950s and 60s, we see the explosion of youth culture, and we also see the explosion of a more casual culture. Everything just changed so quickly in these few years. But also, like, how we lived our lives changed. You know, it's extremely difficult, take it from me, to travel with hats. And what are we seeing in the 50s and 60s? We're seeing an explosion of airplane travel. It is hard to put hats on an airplane. Cars are changing, and how do you wear a hat in a car? You can't wear a big hat in a car. It doesn't fit. Even in those big ass cars of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, you still couldn't wear like huge hats. With technology and culture shifts, it makes sense, and it sucks, frankly. Like, it sucks to know that a trade that was so important for women's autonomy, financial independence, basically got like gutted within like a 30-year time span. It sucks. But with that being said, like, somehow it hasn't completely died out.
Hats are just becoming more and more popular. And I'm noticing this year in particular, there's this big fedora wool fad, and I'm blaming it on Instagram.
Blaming or thanking Instagram?
Well, both.
Yeah. Because
there are lots of videos, which I think are great, don't get me wrong, of people who have a fedora, a wool fedora, and then they, you know, set it on fire, or they add stitches to it, or cut it up and paint it, whatever the case is. So we've been inundated with people who want to make hats like that. Taught a wool class not that long ago. A couple of the people in the class brought up these videos, and I think they were surprised that the class actually entailed them making this hat and not just having fun with it. But I have emails right now from people who want to learn that stuff, and
they
so
want to learn how to set the hat on fire.
Yes, but at Judith M we sell fedoras already made, so there you go. Buy a hat already made if you don't want to do that part, and then set it on fire.
When we went to Judith Millinery Supply, what I saw was a very busy shop that mostly online sales, but they had a bunch of product, they had a bunch of stuff, they had employees, and they were busy.
You notice there's more people interested in learning the millinery trade from you?
Yes, because I used to do a lot more private workshops, and I still do that, but I'm noticing my group workshops are really expanding, and I'm now teaching group workshops at other locations, not just here or Judith M. People will bring me to hotels, and I'll do a group there, or like work the metal, a store down the street, and teach to large groups.
And with that, my friends, I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you have not subscribed to my channel already, go ahead. All right, we're done. Bye. You know the drill. Funny story. I actually dated this guy once, and it was in 2016 during like the peak black felt hat craze phase that summer. And so we were at a bar, and this girl walked in, and she had a hat on. Now listen, this guy knew what I did. He knew that I was into fashion history. He knew that I sewed up clothes. He knew that I had a book coming out. He knew that this is what I did, was weird fashion stuff. Literally in my Bubble profile, I had a picture of me in an oldie-timey outfit, so that way they all knew what they were getting into if they swiped right? And he looked at that woman, and he was like, what is she wearing? Oh my God. And I just looked at him, and I was just like, are you for real, my dude? That was our last date. Because I was like, I'm not gonna be with someone who freaks the fuck out over a woman wearing a black hat. That ain't it. You can't handle me, so if you can't handle that, you can't handle me. So even though I've been fairly normie around you, no, we're done here. Hell, I think I wore a black hat on a date once with him. I don't know, anyways.